going on, guys, and welcome to today's video. And today we are back out here in the garage doing one of the last final things to be able to get this thing ready for off-road. Now, if you saw the title, we are obviously doing suspension work today, but no, would I need to do any suspension work to an Xtreme 35 package Jeep to go off-road? No, that's the whole point of buying this package, so you can go off-road right out of the box and do it really well. But our local off-road trails are extremely hard on wheels. Now, what I mean by that, we have a lot of rocks, we have a lot of ledges, we have a lot of that kind of stuff. So inevitably, you are going to absolutely destroy your wheels when you are off-road, gouge them up. I mean, all of our vehicles that we off-road with, everybody is typically running two sets of wheels and tires. We've got a set of wheels and tires for street use, and then we have another set of wheels and tires for off-road, because if you care about the appearance of your vehicle a little bit, you aren't really going to want to drive around with absolutely destroyed wheels. My previous Grand Cherokee, the wheels were just absolutely ruined. Luckily, I was on cheap, Jeep Wrangler takeoff wheels for the street and for off-road. But I mean, the beads of the wheels were literally getting cracked and broken off. It's just very rocky in some of our local places. So, with a brand new vehicle, I obviously did not want to destroy my factory beadlock capable wheels. They're a good looking wheel, and I would like to be able to daily drive with a set of nice looking wheels and tires. I understand it's a Jeep, but I spent a lot of money on this stupid thing, and I would kind of like it to be able to clean itself up and look nice. So my plan here is to run the factory 35-inch KO2s with the factory wheels on the street. Yeah, I know it's kind of a waste of the beadlock capable wheels, but it is what it is, and it will look neat on road. But for off-road, I had found a set of Takeoff 392 beadlock capable wheels. Let me grab these so we can look at them. All right, so here are our 392 non-Xtreme Recon wheels that I was able to pick up on Facebook Marketplace for relatively cheap. And what we've got on here is the world's cheapest 37-inch mud terrain tire available, at least at this time. These are the JlUR MT Terra Raider tires. Now, yes, these are very off-brand. I believe they're Indonesian tires, but they honestly look pretty darn good. The tread pattern is pretty mud terrain-y, very just kind of copycat of a traditional looking mud terrain. These are load range E, because that's what they had in my cheap tire availability. These are 37 1250 R17s. Like I said, in that load range E, and these darn things on Walmart.com were only $225 a piece. Yeah, that's unheard of for a 37-inch mud terrain. So I had to try them out. And again, I'm not going to be daily driving on these things. If they're loud and howling down the road, they're only going to be bolted on while this thing is going to and from the trail, wheeling for the day, and then it will be returning to its 35-inch tall tires. So to roll all of this together, we are going to be running 37s for off-road and 35s for on-road, and that kind of brings an issue where I didn't want to throw some big, huge, massive lift on this thing to fit the 37s because it was going to look goofy when I put 35s back on this thing. Now, the Xtreme Recon or Xtreme 35 package comes with an 1.5 inch lift from the factory. It's not quite as tall as the Mopar 2-inch lift, but it is obviously taller than a normal Rubicon. So there are many, many guys that have thrown 37s on the Xtreme Recon Xtreme 35 Jeep. Bolt them on, you can go wheeling all day and have no issues other than some tire clearance in the rear when you are articulating, which you can add a thicker bump stop in the rear and completely have no issues. But I'm wanting to add a teeny bit more tire clearance. So what we're going to be doing today is, I think, the most budget-friendly upgrade for the Xtreme Recon and Xtreme 35 package Jeep. We're going to be adding a small 1-inch spring spacer front and rear. We're going to be adding the TerraFlex 2-inch shock extensions, and we're going to be addressing the bump stops in the rear. So with all of this bolted on, we're also going to be putting the Mopar lift lower control arms to add caster that we're going to lose with our little bit of lift. So with all of this bolted on, we should gain 1 inch of height. We should gain 2 inches of down travel with our shock extensions and correctly bump stop the Jeep for 37s and also fix our caster, which is already lacking on an Xtreme 35 package Jeep. And all of this cost me like 300 bucks with the control arms, the spacers, and the shock extensions. So we are in this very, very cheap in the Jeep world. And my whole thought was 1 inch additional lift is not going to make the 35s look too small for my street driving, but it also is going to give us a little bit more room for the 37s. A lot of guys have found that the front extended bump stops that come with the Xtreme 35 package are almost too darn long. When you're off-road and moving the suspension through its travel, the front travel or up travel is very, very limited. You are banging off the front bump stops often while going down the trail. So our 1 inch spacer should add a little bit more clearance between the front bump stop and the bump stop pad, which is going to help the ride when off-road. So let's go look at all of my parts and pieces and then we'll start getting this put on. Okay guys, so what we've got going on here is our two front lower Mopar lift kit control arms, which add a degree and a half or so of caster with a lift. Talking about bump stops, we've got the Mopar 2 inch lift rear bump stops here. The Xtreme 35 package Jeep comes with a factory 1 inch bump stop extension. These are a 2 inch, which is what most guys are finding is needed when running 37s on the back of these things to keep the tires and wheels up out of the inner fender area. Now in the rear, we are running the TerraFlex 1/2 inch spring spacer kit, which comes with the hardware to bolt this all together, but I've also got the 1/2 inch front spacers for JK or JT that I have done a little bit of modification to so I can stack the front spacer on the rear spacer and have a total of 1 inch, because as far as I can tell, TerraFlex does not have a 1 inch rear spacer, and I really like the TerraFlex kit because it is bolted and holds itself onto the vehicle. So that's why I've chosen to cut and modify the 1/2 inch front spacer, which all it is just cutting this raised lip off, cutting the 2 nubs off the back and drilling a small hole here so the spacer can lock together as they would supposed to, and then you've got a 1 inch spacer. Moving on to the front, we've got the just TerraFlex 1 inch front spring spacer, so we will have our equal front and rear 1 inch of lift. And then our shock extensions. Again, this is the TerraFlex kit, and it honestly looks like a really quality thing. I have not ever installed these, but these are going to basically move our shock mounting point up 1.5 inches or so, so we have a little bit more down travel with that suspension. Now guys, the only issue that you could run into with adding shock extensions is any amount that you extend that shock travel, you are also reducing the amount of available up travel of the shock. But I think I've done my research enough to figure out that the bump stop extensions that come with the Xtreme 35 package Jeep are so darn long that we still should probably maybe be okay with these shock extensions on our up travel measurements. Now, I am not going to take you guys through a complete suspension teardown and installation. This video was more of just showing you all of my parts and pieces that I have picked to throw on this thing that will hopefully work well. So like I said, I'm not going to show you guys taking out every single bolt. I've got a bunch of videos about doing suspension work, nice videos up on a lift where we can actually see what I'm doing. What I'm going to do is off camera, tear the suspension apart, start putting my parts and pieces on. I think I will pull my springs out and put those shock extensions on, pull you guys back out so both of us can look together and see with this setup, are we going to be touching our bump stops before our shocks fully collapse? Because you do not want your shocks being your travel limiting device. You obviously want those bump stops. So I'm gonna tear this thing apart, and then next time you guys see me, I will be hopefully testing our suspension articulation without the springs in this thing to determine if this is the best budget setup for your Xtreme Recon or Xtreme 35. So I'm gonna start tearing this thing apart, and I'll see you guys just here in a second. All right, so we've got the front springs off, and I added the front shock extension brackets and have cycled the suspension all the way up, and I have very good news, so let's take a look. Okay guys, so as we can see, we do have our 2-inch TerraFlex extensions installed, and man, these are a really nice product. Zinc coated hardware. These are nice CNC'd, billet blocks, and they fit like really perfectly. They've got a little screw here or bolt on the bottom to locate them so they can't even rotate if you left that loose, and the factory hardware fits really nicely up here for the shock. But the big important thing is the bump stop. The bump stop does touch before the shock fully collapses. I think where I have the jack shoved up right now has the shock collapsed, and we are smushing our bump stop. So we are probably like right there borderline at the fact that our shock is going to be a teeny bit, or could be a teeny bit too long, but we are already completely smashing that lower bump stop. So I think we are going to be just about perfect with this budget setup. Now, what we did not want to see was our shock fully collapse before we touched the bump stop. That's when you run into your shock being your bump stop, and you're just beating the heck out of the shock. Internally, the piston's going up and ramming the top of the shock body. Is just not very good. I guess it would be the bottom of the shock body, but you understand what I'm saying. You don't want to use your shocks for bump stops. So we proved right here with a 2-inch shock extension on those factory XR shocks. We have still full up travel, and we are smushing our bump stop. So I think it's going to work very perfectly. Now the rear could be a completely different story, but we will figure that out once we get back there. So what I need to do now on the front is lower this back down, unbolt the shocks, lower the axle, get our 1-inch spacer installed, and throw my springs back on, and still obviously get my Mopar front lower control arms on there to add our caster. But I'm super excited that my calculations, I think, are going to be just about perfect, at least here in the front. So I'll throw the front on, get it all buttoned up, and then we will move on to the rear. So here we are all buttoned up. We've got our 1-inch TerraFlex spacer up top. We've got our 2-inch TerraFlex shock extensions. We've got our Mopar 2-inch lift lower control arms here to correct our caster. And here is the suspension sitting here at full droop. So this is the shocks fully extended, and we are getting relatively close to a straight sway bar, but we still have a decent little angle here. So I don't think we are ever going to be in worries about having a sway bar inverted out on the trail, since we still have a decent little angle here. And again, this is all the way down travel, or at full droop of our front suspension. So again, I don't think we're ever going to be running into an inverted sway bar, but again, first wheeling trip, we'll keep an eye on it and see how it does. Okay, and here we are now at vehicle ride height. We've got the jack lifted up, holding the front axle nice and level until I came off of the jack stand. So this is how the thing is going to sit on the ground. We've got a pretty darn flat sway bar angle there. And this is kind of what we were using the 1-inch spring spacers for. The factory Xtreme Recon Xtreme 35 package front bump stop tower is like ridiculously long. So even with another inch, we still just don't have that much room between the bump stop pad and our bump stop. So adding that 1-inch spacer is just helping us get a little more suspension travel room before we are already on our bump stop. Here's where our shocks are sitting with those spacers or extensions here down at the bottom, and then our nice OEM Mopar lift lower control arms. So we've got the rear end all mocked up here. So we've got our 2-inch bump stop extensions, or the platform there on the bottom. We've got our 2-inch shock extensions bolted on, and I've got one side of the axle shoved up as far as possible because, like we already said, we're trying to see if the shock collapses first or if we hit the bump stop. So as you guys can see, we've got our extension on, our 2-inch bump stop, and we are smashing our bump stop and still have at least a teeny bit of shock up travel, or it is fully collapsed. But we are still not collapsing our shock and using it as a bump stop. As you guys can blatantly see, our bump stop is pretty darn smashed over here. Now guys, the axle is sitting all the way back down at full droop now, and I did run into one issue. Our sway bar is going to be hitting our shocks long before I can get the sway bar bolted back up. Here is the sway bar link hole. We're, an inch or so off. So there's a couple different ways to remedy that, whether we go with a longer rear sway bar link. They do make some spacers that you can put on the sway bar to space it down away from the frame, effectively giving you a longer sway bar link. Or I think I'm going to try relocating the bolt hole for the factory sway bar link. As you can see, our rear sway bar link tab is this large piece right here, and that bolt hole is all the way down at the bottom. As you can see, we can't quite get our sway bar link to line back up since we are hitting on our shock up here. But I think we've got enough room that we could relocate a bolt hole right up here, drill a hole into this tab, and then we would effectively have our sway bar mounted right about here on that tab, which gives us almost a perfect little gap up here between our sway bar and the shock. So I think that's going to be my $0 fix, is just relocating a small hole, or excuse me, a hole the same size as this one up here at the highest position on that sway bar link tab. And that should take care of our issue. We'll be able to run the nice factory sway bar links and still have clearance up here at the shock. So we've got final product here I will show you guys. I did re-drill the rear sway bar link hole on the sway bar link tab, moved it up as far as I felt comfortable with, and we do have clearance. This is full droop now with everything hooked up, sway bar hooked up, rear shocks bolted on, springs bolted on. And as you guys can see, we have just a little bit of sway bar to shock clearance at full droop. We've got our 2-inch rear bump stop extensions from the Mopar lift. Since we did remove the 1-inch factory Xtreme Recon Xtreme 35 package rear bump stop. Up here at the top of our springs, we've got our homemade TerraFlex 1-inch spring spacer. Down here at the bottom, we've got our 2-inch TerraFlex shock extension. And here's where you can see I re-drilled from the factory location all the way up to the very top here of our rear sway bar link tab on the axle. That was just a 1/2-inch drill bit there, and got those to fit and bolt on really nicely there on each side. All right guys, here is our final product here with our 1-inch spring spacer, 2-inch shock extensions. We've got bump stops in the back, and in the front we've got our Mopar 2-inch lift lower control arms to fix our caster. So what we've got accomplished here today is adding a little more clearance between the suspension or the axle and the front bump stops, which is a common issue with the Xtreme 35 package or Xtreme Recon. Due to the fact that those bump stop towers are so darn long, there is very little up travel. So we've got another inch of clearance there, but back in the rear, we've also been properly bump stopped for 37s on this thing. So when we go off-road, we'll be able to bolt the 37s on and wheel as hard as we want with no worry. We've also gained 2 inches of down travel in the suspension because our shocks are effectively 2 inches longer now. And we've shown here today that you still have full up travel even with those 2-inch shock extensions due to the crazy long bump stops in the front and the addition of our 2-inch bump stop spacer there in the rear. Now, those Mopar front lower control arms are an awesome cheap add to get a 1.5 degrees or so of front caster on these Jeeps, which is very beneficial when you are lifting it, but even stock height, it is a very beneficial mod. The only issue we ran into was there in the back with the stock length Xtreme Recon sway bar links being too short, bolting to that factory location. That's why we re-drilled higher up, and now I believe we've got good clearance there between the shock and the rear sway bar. But we will hopefully be able to take a closer look once we are actually off-roading this thing here shortly to kind of double check all of our clearances. But here's how we stand, and my whole goal without doing a full-on, multiple inch suspension lift was the fact I still want to daily drive on the 35s. And if you go too much taller, I think with your highline fendered Rubicon, you start to look a little bit small in the tire department. Now, in person, and I guess on camera, I think this thing still looks proportional, even with that additional inch of lift here in the front. So, it looks good, still on the 35s, and we now have proper clearance, proper bump stops for 37s when we are off-road on the trail. So I think this is the best of both worlds, and it's still going to work really well. Like I said, at least in our wheeling environment, you are absolutely going to destroy your wheels with rocks, and that's why we've got the other set of 37s sitting up there in the garage. So guys, hopefully this was helpful if you're an Xtreme Recon or Xtreme 35 owner and wanting to go a little bit taller, but not wanting to go crazy with a whole blown suspension lift, because we already have a really good base to work on. With all of these shock extensions and spring spacers, this thing is still going to ride identically to stock. We didn't change spring rates, we didn't change shock tuning, nothing changed. This is going to ride and drive identically to stock. There is nothing different with the parts that matter on suspension, handling, all of that. So it's still going to drive completely normal. We've just gained a little bit of height and a little bit of shock down travel. So guys, I will throw links down in the description to all of these parts and pieces that I've, hodgepodged together here to make this suspension lift or suspension upgrade. I will have Amazon links to everything, but what I honestly did was stocked eBay. I was able to buy a few of those TerraFlex parts and pieces used and secondhand on eBay for way cheaper than it would have been to buy new. So I was able to save some decent money there. But again, I think I got like $300 into all of this. The Mopar control arms, the rear bump stop extensions, the shock spacers, and the spring spacers. So it's a super cheap upgrade that I think still looks good with the 35. So thanks for coming out into the garage, and for me, for the first time in a very long time, doing suspension work on the ground instead of at the shop up on a lift, and it really wasn't too bad. So guys, thanks for coming out into the garage with me today, and as always, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time.